Chapter 1. Before Sauron became a name spoken in fear across Middle-earth, before it was whispered in the shadowed halls of Gondor or carved into memory by elves who would never forget, he existed as something far more subtle, more dangerous, and more difficult to recognize. For in the beginning he was not a tyrant, nor a warlord, nor even an enemy, but a being of order, structure, and immense creative intelligence, one of the Ainur who entered the world at its foundation, shaped not by malice but by an overwhelming desire for harmony imposed from above rather than grown freely from within. And it is in this earliest state, long before the forging of rings or the raising of fortresses, that the true nature of Sauron must be understood, because his later cruelty cannot be separated from the virtues that first defined him, for he was originally known as Mairon, a name that reflected admiration rather than dread, signifying excellence, order, and a love of precision, and among the spirits who descended into the world, he was distinguished by a remarkable devotion to craftsmanship, coordination, and efficiency, drawn instinctively to systems that worked without waste or chaos. And unlike many others who delighted primarily in music, light, or the untamed beauty of creation, Mairon was fascinated by structure itself, by the way things could be arranged, regulated, and perfected, a fascination that made him especially receptive to the influence of greater powers who promised mastery over the world's design. And it was this inclination that first led him into the service of Morgoth, not out of a lust for destruction, but from a belief that through a single dominating will, the discord of the world could be corrected, a belief that would later harden into tyranny, but which in the beginning still carried the illusion of benevolence, because Morgoth, though already corrupted, presented himself not merely as a destroyer, but as a force capable of reshaping Arda. According to a singular vision, and to a mind like Mairon's, the promise of absolute order was irresistible, especially in a world where the freedom of others inevitably produced unpredictability and imperfection. And so Mairon became Morgoth's most capable lieutenant, not his equal in raw power, but superior in subtlety, planning, and endurance, learning from him the arts of domination, deception, and the long game of corruption that did not rely on brute force alone. And while Morgoth reveled in devastation and open defiance, Mairon studied how systems could be bent, how institutions could be infiltrated, how loyalty could be manufactured, and how fear could be made self-sustaining, absorbing these lessons with frightening discipline. And yet even then he wasn't wholly consumed by hatred, for his loyalty was less emotional than ideological, rooted in the conviction that the world required a supreme architect, someone willing to impose a grand design, regardless of the cost, and this conviction would survive Morgoth's eventual defeat, becoming the seed from which Sauron's independent power would grow, because when Morgoth was cast down at the end of the First Age, Mairon was faced with a moment that defined his destiny more than any battle or conquest, a moment of choice that revealed the depth of his self-deception, for he was offered a chance at repentance, a chance to return to the service of the Valar, and abandon the path of domination. And for a brief time he hesitated, not out of remorse for suffering caused, but out of fear of punishment and loss of status. And this distinction is crucial, because it shows that even at the edge of forgiveness, his motivation remained centered on himself, and in the end, he rejected true submission, unwilling to endure humility or judgment, choosing instead to hide, to endure, and to rebuild in secret. And it is here that Mairon truly became Sauron, not through a sudden transformation, but through a conscious decision to pursue control without master or rival, to perfect domination in a way even Morgoth had failed to do. And thus began the long Second Age, an era defined not by open apocalypse but by manipulation, patience, and the slow erosion of free will, during which Sauron abandoned the chaotic brutality of his former lord and embraced a far more effective strategy, one that relied on appearing fair, wise, and generous, understanding that fear alone could not sustain lasting rule. and so he assumed forms that inspired trust, presenting himself as a teacher, a giver of gifts, and a guide to prosperity, exploiting the lingering wounds left by Morgoth's wars and the desire of elves and men alike for stability and advancement. And this approach reached its peak in his dealings with the elves of Eregion, where his knowledge of craft, drawn from his earliest inclinations as Mairon, allowed him to offer insights into ring-making that promised preservation and enhancement rather than domination, a promise that resonated deeply with beings who feared decay and the slow fading of their works. And in this context, the forging of the rings of power was not initially perceived as an act of evil, but as an extension of a shared desire to hold back the passage of time, and yet hidden within this collaboration was the culmination of Sauron's philosophy, the creation of a system of control so elegant and centralized that it mirrored his vision of perfect order, a system embodied in the One Ring, forged in secrecy as the keystone of a hierarchy that would bind all others to his will. And while this act is often remembered as a moment of outright villainy, it is more accurately understood as the logical endpoint of a worldview that had been forming since the earliest days of the world, a worldview that could not tolerate autonomy, unpredictability, or resistance, and which therefore sought to concentrate authority into a single, unchallenged source. And it is precisely this obsession with order rather than simple cruelty that makes Sauron such a uniquely terrifying figure in the history of Middle-earth, because he does not seek destruction for its own sake, but subjugation in the name of efficiency, a philosophy that transforms suffering into a byproduct rather than a goal, making it easier to justify and endlessly repeat. And, as the Second Age progressed, this ideology would manifest not only in the forging of rings, but in the creation of realms, laws, and armies designed to function as extensions of Sauron's will, reducing individuals to components within a vast mechanism of control. And though he would suffer defeats, lose physical form, and endure centuries of diminished power, the core of his identity would remain unchanged, anchored in the belief that only through domination could the world be saved from itself, a belief that rendered repentance impossible and ensured that every opportunity for mercy would be interpreted as weakness. And thus, long before the War of the Ring, long before his name became synonymous with darkness, Sauron had already sealed his fate, not through a single act of evil, but through a persistent refusal to accept a world in which he was not supreme, a refusal that transformed a spirit of order into an engine of tyranny, and set the stage for every conflict, betrayal, and tragedy that would follow, making his story not merely one of power lost and regained, but of a mind that mistook control for harmony, and in doing so condemned both himself and countless others to an age of unending struggle. Chapter 2. After Morgoth's defeat and the breaking of his dominion at the end of the First Age, the world of Arda entered a period that outwardly appeared calmer, yet beneath the surface it remained fractured, scarred by centuries of ruin, and it was within this fragile landscape that Sauron began the most decisive transformation of his existence, a transformation not marked by thunder or flame but by silence, calculation, and endurance. For unlike his former master, who had challenged the Valar openly and gloried in defiance, Sauron understood that survival itself could be a form of victory. And so, when Morgoth was cast into the void and the armies of the west withdrew, Sauron did not immediately rise as a visible threat, but receded into the margins of the world, taking with him not only his knowledge but also a profound lesson learned from catastrophe, namely, that power sustained solely by fear and force inevitably provoked resistance strong enough to destroy it, and therefore any future dominion would need to be built differently, patiently, invisibly, and with a sophistication Morgoth had never possessed. And this realization shaped every choice Sauron made in the early Second Age, beginning with his refusal to seek forgiveness sincerely, because although the Valar offered him a path back into the order of the world, it would have required confession, humility, and a willingness to submit to judgment, conditions that struck at the core of Sauron's identity, for submission would have meant acknowledging that his vision of order was flawed, that authority could exist without him, and that the world did not require a singular guiding will to function. And so rather than face this existential contradiction, he chose concealment over repentance, hiding his malice behind a veil of apparent compliance until even the desire for forgiveness curdled into resentment. And it was during this period of concealment that Sauron refined the most dangerous aspect of his character, his ability to appear benign, to wear righteousness as a disguise, and to weaponize trust. For he understood that in a world recovering from devastation, the promise of stability, guidance, and restoration would be more alluring than open conquest, especially to those who feared the slow decay of their achievements. And so Sauron re-emerged not as a tyrant but as a benefactor, adopting forms pleasing to the eye and manner, presenting himself as a being of wisdom who had learned from the mistakes of the past. And this carefully constructed persona allowed him to move freely among elves and men, offering counsel that seemed generous, practical, and rooted in shared goals, and nowhere was this strategy more successful than among the elves of Middle-earth, particularly those who remained east of the sea and felt the weight of time pressing upon their works. For although the elves were immortal, their creations were not, and the fading of beauty, memory, and craftsmanship troubled them deeply, a vulnerability Sauron understood with chilling clarity. And so when he approached the realm of Eregion, he did not speak of domination or obedience, but of preservation, of techniques that could bind the beauty of the present against the erosion of years, presenting his knowledge as a gift rather than a demand. And in doing so he positioned himself not as a ruler, but as a collaborator, someone whose expertise could elevate the achievements of others rather than replace them. And this illusion of partnership was essential, because it allowed Sauron to embed himself within the creative processes of the elves, learning their strengths, their fears, and their limits, while subtly guiding their ambitions toward outcomes that served his long-term design. And it is important to understand that at this stage Sauron's power was not enforced through armies or terror, but through influence, through the quiet shaping of goals and expectations, a method far more enduring than violence, because those who believed they were acting freely were less likely to resist. And this approach culminated in the forging of the Rings of Power, an endeavor that outwardly symbolized cooperation and shared purpose, yet inwardly embodied Sauron's belief that systems function best when they are centralized, hierarchical, and responsive to a single controlling intelligence. And while the elven smiths believed they were crafting tools to enhance and preserve their realms, Sauron envisioned a network of influence, a lattice of power through which will itself could be transmitted and regulated. And this conceptual difference between intention and outcome reveals the true nature of Sauron's evil, which lies not in overt cruelty, but in the appropriation of others' desires, bending them toward ends they did not choose. And when the One Ring was forged in secret, it represented not merely a weapon, but the crystallization of Sauron's philosophy, the belief that order imposed from above was superior to freedom negotiated among equals. And although the elves ultimately perceived the deception and rejected his control, forcing Sauron into open war, the damage had already been done. Because the rings existed, their influence could not be undone, and the precedent for domination through artifice had been established. And even Sauron's defeat at the hands of the Last Alliance did not erase this legacy, for although his physical form was destroyed and the ring taken from him, his spirit endured, bound to the very mechanism he had created, demonstrating once again the resilience of a being who valued survival above pride. And it is during the long centuries that followed, when Sauron existed as a shadow rather than a sovereign, that his endurance becomes most apparent, because stripped of armies, fortresses, and visible authority, he nonetheless continued to exert influence through fear, memory, and the lingering effects of his designs. And this persistence reveals a critical distinction between Sauron and other antagonistic forces in the history of Middle-earth. namely, that his power wasn't dependent on constant action, but on systems set in motion long before, systems that continued to function even in his absence, such as the corruption of men through the rings, the institutionalization of cruelty in realms that had once been noble, and the normalization of obedience as a survival strategy. And as the Third Age dawned and Sauron slowly regained strength, his return was not marked by dramatic conquest, but by the reactivation of these dormant structures, calling servants who had already been shaped by his influence, reclaiming territories that had never truly escaped his shadow, and reasserting his claim not through innovation, but through continuity, proving that the most effective form of domination is the one that outlives the dominator's presence, and this continuity underscores the tragic irony at the heart of Sauron's story, because in his relentless pursuit of order, he created a world defined by stagnation and fear, a world incapable of growth precisely because it was bound too tightly to his will, and yet he remained convinced that without him chaos would reign, unable to recognize that the resilience of Middle-earth lay not in uniformity but in diversity, not in centralized authority but in the unpredictable cooperation of free peoples, a truth he could neither accept nor comprehend. And thus, as centuries passed and the memory of Morgoth faded into legend, Sauron emerged not as a relic of an older evil, but as something new, more insidious, a power that did not announce itself with thunder but with inevitability, presenting domination as stability and submission as peace, and it is this capacity to redefine oppression as order that ensured his continued relevance and made his eventual downfall so difficult, because he was not merely a Dark Lord seeking conquest, but the architect of a worldview that transformed control into virtue, a worldview that could only be defeated by rejecting its fundamental premise, namely, that safety requires surrender, a rejection that would come at great cost and require courage of a kind Sauron never understood, setting the stage for the conflicts, sacrifices, and moral choices that would define the War of the Ring and determine the fate of Middle-earth itself. Chapter 3. As the Second Age began and the scars of Morgoth's wars slowly faded from the visible face of Middle-earth, a deceptive sense of renewal took hold among its peoples, for the overthrow of the first Dark Lord created the illusion that the world had been cleansed of ultimate evil, and it was precisely this illusion that allowed Sauron to act with greater freedom than ever before, because while the Valar withdrew from direct involvement and the free peoples turned toward rebuilding, he was able to move unseen, unchallenged, and unremembered, reshaping his methods in response to the failures of the past. And it was during this time that Sauron perfected the art of appearing benevolent, understanding that domination achieved through consent, or at least through the belief in consent, was far more stable than domination imposed by terror alone, and so he returned to Middle-earth not in armor or flame, but in a form that inspired confidence and admiration, presenting himself as a being of knowledge who had mastered arts long forgotten, and this return marked a decisive shift in his strategy, because no longer content to rule through fear as Morgoth had done, Sauron sought instead to rule through structure, influence, and dependency, embedding his will within the very institutions and ambitions of others. And in doing so, he demonstrated a profound understanding of the psychology of power, recognizing that those who believe they are advancing their own goals are less likely to perceive themselves as enslaved, and thus more likely to defend the system that binds them. And this insight guided his interactions with both elves and men during the early centuries of the Second Age, as he positioned himself as a guide to progress rather than a conqueror, offering solutions to problems that seemed insoluble, particularly the problem of decline, which haunted the elves who remained in Middle-earth and weighed heavily on the men who sought greatness in a world still recovering from ruin. And it was among the elves that Sauron's approach proved most sophisticated, because he understood that they did not fear death as men did, but fading, the slow erosion of memory, craft, and beauty, and by appealing to this fear he was able to frame his knowledge as a means of preservation rather than control, presenting his teachings as tools that would allow the elves to maintain their realms unchanged by time. And this promise resonated deeply, especially with those who had not seen the light of the trees, and therefore felt more acutely the loss of perfection that lay beyond the sea. And yet, even as Sauron appeared generous and cooperative, his actions were guided by a rigid internal logic, one that sought always to reduce complexity, to eliminate unpredictability, and to align disparate wills toward a single, overarching design, a design in which he alone would serve as the unifying intelligence. And this logic manifested not only in his technological contributions, but in the subtle way he encouraged reliance, ensuring that those who benefited from his guidance gradually lost the ability to act independently. And this erosion of autonomy was not enforced but cultivated, growing slowly as trust deepened and habits formed. And it is in this slow cultivation that the true danger of Sauron's Second Age strategy can be seen, because it did not provoke immediate resistance, nor did it require overt acts of cruelty, instead functioning as a kind of moral anesthesia that dulled the instinct for self-determination. And while the elves would eventually perceive the threat and resist it, the very fact that such resistance took time demonstrates how effective Sauron's disguise had been, and how thoroughly he had embedded himself within their aspirations. And beyond the elven realms, Sauron also extended his influence among men, though here his methods differed because men were more susceptible to fear, ambition, and the desire for swift advancement, and so he offered them not preservation but empowerment, presenting his gifts as means to surpass natural limits, to build kingdoms of unprecedented scale and stability. And in doing so he positioned himself as a catalyst for greatness rather than its master, allowing men to believe that their achievements were self-wrought even as they became increasingly dependent on his favor. And this dual approach, preservation for the elves and empowerment for men, reveals the adaptability of Sauron's strategy, because he did not impose a single narrative upon all peoples, but tailored his message to resonate with their deepest anxieties and desires, reinforcing the perception that he understood them better than they understood themselves. And this perception was crucial because it transformed Sauron from an external force into an internal reference point, someone whose approval, guidance, or absence subtly shaped decision-making across Middle-earth. And as decades passed and his presence became normalized, the memory of Morgoth receded further into myth, making it easier for Sauron to distance himself from that legacy and present his own rule as something fundamentally different, more reasonable, more constructive, and more aligned with the needs of the world as it was rather than the world as it had been. And yet beneath this veneer of pragmatism lay the same fundamental refusal to accept a pluralistic reality, the same conviction that order required submission. And it is this continuity of belief that ultimately undermined his efforts, because no matter how refined his methods became, they were still rooted in the assumption that freedom was a problem to be solved rather than a value to be preserved. And thus, even as Sauron appeared to usher in an age of learning, craft, and apparent stability, he was in fact laying the groundwork for a far more comprehensive form of domination, one that would not merely command obedience but redefine it, transforming submission into cooperation and control into collaboration. And it was this transformation that made the Second Age uniquely dangerous, because it blurred the moral boundaries between guidance and manipulation, between leadership and tyranny. And as the age progressed, these blurred boundaries would harden into chains, binding those who had once welcomed Sauron's counsel into a system from which escape would require sacrifice, war, and the rejection of everything he had promised, setting the stage for the revelations, betrayals, and conflicts that would soon shatter the illusion of harmony and expose the true cost of order imposed from above. Chapter 4: Eregion, also known as Holland, stood at a unique crossroads of geography, history, and ambition during the Second Age, and it was precisely this convergence that made it the ideal stage for Sauron's most sophisticated act of manipulation, for the realm lay close to Khazad-dûm, benefiting from friendship with the dwarves, enriched by trade, and populated by elves whose greatest pride was not conquest or dominion, but craft, knowledge, and the preservation of beauty through skill, and among them were smiths unmatched in Middle-earth since the days of Feanor, elves who believed that through mastery of artifice they could arrest decay and safeguard their achievements against the slow wearing of time, and it was into this environment that Sauron entered under a fair and persuasive guise, presenting himself not as a ruler but as a fellow artisan, someone who spoke their language, admired their work, and shared their unease about impermanence, and this shared concern formed the foundation of a relationship that outwardly appeared collaborative and mutually beneficial, yet inwardly was profoundly asymmetrical, because while the elven smith sought refinement and preservation, Sauron pursued integration and control, and this difference in ultimate purpose would determine the fate of Eregion, long before its walls were ever breached. And in his dealings with the elves, Sauron demonstrated an extraordinary sensitivity to their values, never dismissing their traditions or imposing his own authority overtly, but instead offering insights framed as enhancements rather than replacements, allowing the elves to believe that they remained masters of their own creations even as they adopted principles that subtly aligned their work with his worldview. And central to this process was the idea that craft could transcend its limitations, that through the correct application of knowledge it was possible to bind qualities such as strength, beauty, and endurance into physical forms in ways previously unattainable, an idea that resonated deeply with artisans who already believed in the moral and spiritual significance of their labor. And as these techniques were explored and refined, the very act of creation became increasingly systematized, guided by rules and hierarchies that mirrored Sauron's belief in ordered power. And while the elves viewed this as progress, as the natural evolution of their art, Sauron viewed it as the construction of a framework through which influence could flow, a framework that would eventually allow will itself to be shaped and transmitted. And it is crucial to note that the rings of power did not emerge suddenly as instruments of domination, but gradually, as the culmination of many incremental advances that each seemed reasonable in isolation, because Sauron understood that revolutionary change provokes resistance, whereas evolutionary change invites acceptance, and by embedding his ideas within the ongoing creative efforts of the elves, he ensured that his presence became indispensable before it ever became suspect, and this indispensability was not enforced through threats or coercion, but through reliance, as the elven smiths came to depend on the knowledge he provided, integrating it so deeply into their work that separating their own achievements from his influence became increasingly difficult, and yet despite this deep entanglement, Sauron was careful to withhold a crucial element of his design, maintaining a degree of opacity that preserved his advantage, because collaboration without transparency creates dependency without equality, and it was within this controlled asymmetry that the true danger of the rings took shape, for while the elves believed they were crafting tools that would serve their realms independently, Sauron was quietly designing a hierarchy, a system in which all such tools would ultimately answer to a single source, and when the rings were finally forged, they embodied this duality perfectly, appearing as artifacts of preservation and enhancement, yet containing within them the capacity for influence that Sauron alone fully understood, and the forging of the three rings by the elves without Sauron's direct involvement represents a moment of partial resistance, a recognition, however incomplete, that absolute reliance carried risks. Yet even this act did not escape the broader framework he had established, because the underlying principles of ring-making remained aligned with his vision, demonstrating how deeply his influence had penetrated their craft. And when Sauron withdrew to forge the One Ring in secret, he was not abandoning collaboration, but completing it on his own terms, creating the keystone that would bind the entire system together. And the secrecy of this act underscores the fundamental dishonesty of his enterprise, because true partnership does not require concealment. And the moment the One Ring was completed, the illusion of equality collapsed, revealing the rings of power as components of a mechanism designed to centralize authority. And it was at this point that the elves perceived the truth, sensing the intrusion of an external will upon their minds and rejecting it, removing their rings and breaking the immediate chain of domination. Yet even this rejection could not undo what had been created, because the knowledge, techniques, and ambitions that Sauron had nurtured within Eregion could not simply be erased, and the realm itself, once a symbol of creative collaboration, became instead a testament to the dangers of uncritical trust and the belief that technical mastery alone could safeguard moral integrity. And Sauron's response to this rejection further reveals the nature of his character, for rather than abandoning his design, he turned to force, exposing the violence that lay beneath his refined methods. And the war that followed was not merely a military conflict, but the violent resolution of a philosophical contradiction, the collision between free creation and imposed order. And although Eregion would fall and its people suffer greatly, the legacy of its craft would endure, shaping the destinies of elves, men, and dwarves alike. And in this way, Eregion stands as a pivotal chapter in the history of Middle-earth, not because it marked the beginning of Sauron's evil, but because it demonstrated how easily the pursuit of preservation and progress can be co-opted by a will that values order above freedom, turning the highest achievements of art into instruments of control and transforming a realm of makers into the foundation of a system that would threaten the entire world. Chapter 5. The forging of the One Ring was not an impulsive act of malice, nor a sudden escalation toward open tyranny, but the deliberate completion of a design that had been forming in Sauron's mind since the earliest days of his service to Morgoth, refined through centuries of observation, failure, and adaptation, and it represented the moment in which his philosophy of order was finally given physical form. For unlike the other rings of power, which were conceived as instruments of preservation, enhancement, or authority within existing hierarchies, the One Ring was conceived as a governing principle, a singular axis around which all other powers would turn, and this distinction is essential to understanding both its immense potency and its inherent limitation, because the ring was not merely a tool Sauron wielded, but an extension of his own being, infused with his will, his intent, and his capacity to dominate, binding his fate to its existence in a way that ensured both unprecedented control and catastrophic vulnerability. And when Sauron chose the fires of Orodruin as the site of its creation, he was not acting out of symbolism alone, but necessity, for only there could such a concentration of power be achieved, and only there could he invest so much of himself into an object without immediate dissolution. And this act of self-investment marked a decisive departure from Morgoth's approach to power, because while Morgoth dispersed his essence throughout the world in a way that corrupted all of Arda, but weakened his personal agency, Sauron concentrated his power, accepting the risk of dependency in exchange for precision and efficiency, believing that centralized control was superior to diffuse influence. And this belief shaped every aspect of the ring's function, from its ability to dominate other rings to its capacity to amplify Sauron's presence across vast distances, allowing him to exert authority without constant physical manifestation. And yet, the ring's most dangerous feature was not its overt power, but its subtlety, its ability to align the desires of others with its own purpose, offering strength, clarity, and mastery while gradually eroding autonomy. And this mechanism reflects Sauron's understanding of domination as a psychological process rather than a purely physical one. because he recognized that obedience enforced through terror is unstable, whereas obedience internalized through perceived benefit is enduring, and thus the ring did not coerce its bearers openly, but seduced them, presenting itself as a means to achieve their own ends, even as it reshaped those ends to align with Sauron's will. And in this way, the One Ring functioned as both a master key and a mirror, unlocking latent ambition while reflecting back a vision of power that ultimately served only its maker. And when Sauron first donned the ring, the effect was immediate and profound, as the other ring bearers became aware of his presence and intent, revealing the true nature of the system they had unwittingly helped to create. And the elves' swift rejection of the rings demonstrated both their resilience and the limits of Sauron's control, because while the ring granted him the ability to dominate, it did not guarantee obedience, especially among those whose wills were strengthened by long discipline and moral clarity. And this resistance forced Sauron into open conflict, transforming a covert system of influence into a war of conquest. Yet even this outcome did not invalidate the ring's purpose, because it had already altered the balance of power, ensuring that any future victory or defeat would be shaped by its existence. And as Sauron's wars expanded across Middle-earth, the ring became the focal point of his strategy, not merely as a weapon, but as a source of legitimacy, because through it he embodied the principle that authority flowed from a single center, reinforcing his claim to rule not as a tyrant among many, but as the sole architect of order. And this claim resonated especially among those who feared chaos more than oppression, for the ring promised certainty in a world still haunted by ruin, and yet the more Sauron relied upon the ring, the more his identity became entangled with it, narrowing his capacity to adapt and reinforcing his belief that control must be absolute or it would fail entirely. And this rigidity would later prove disastrous, because while the ring magnified his strengths, it also amplified his weaknesses, particularly his inability to comprehend self-sacrifice, humility, or the rejection of power as a moral choice, concepts that lay entirely outside his worldview. And this blind spot is woven into the ring itself, which cannot conceive of its own destruction, and therefore exerts no influence to prevent it, a flaw that mirrors Sauron's conviction that no one would willingly abandon such power. And as the ring passed into history, lost and found, its influence persisted not because Sauron actively commanded it at all times, but because it carried within it the logic of domination he had perfected, exerting pressure upon the world even in his absence, shaping events through temptation, fear, and obsession. And this persistence underscores the paradox at the heart of the One Ring, for while it was created to ensure absolute control, it ultimately ensured that Sauron's fate would be decided not solely by his own actions, but by the choices of others, choices he neither anticipated nor respected. And thus, the ring stands not only as the greatest artifact of Sauron's power, but as the embodiment of his greatest error, the belief that order could be perfected through total control, a belief that blinded him to the resilience of free will and the unpredictable strength of those who act without desire for domination, setting in motion a chain of events that would span ages and culminate in the unmaking of both the ring and its maker's ambitions, proving that even the most meticulously designed system cannot endure when it denies the fundamental complexity of the world it seeks to govern. Chapter 6. The war between Sauron and the elves was not the result of a sudden revelation or an impulsive act of violence, but the inevitable collapse of a carefully maintained illusion, because once the elves perceived the presence of Sauron's will within the rings, the fragile balance between cooperation and domination shattered irreversibly, and in that moment Sauron's strategy was forced to abandon subtlety and reveal the coercive force that had always underpinned his vision of order, transforming a hidden system of influence into an open campaign of conquest. And this transition marked a critical turning point in the history of the Second Age, for it exposed both the strength and the limitations of Sauron's methods, demonstrating how thoroughly he had prepared the ground for war long before the first armies marched. And when the elves rejected the rings and removed them from use, Sauron responded not with negotiation or retreat, but with swift militarization, because the refusal of control was, in his philosophy, indistinguishable from rebellion, and rebellion demanded suppression, and thus the War of the Elves and Sauron began not as a contest of equal powers, but as the enforcement of a system whose authority had been denied. And in the early stages of the conflict, Sauron's advantage lay not only in the strength of his forces, but in his intimate knowledge of his enemies, knowledge acquired through years of collaboration, observation, and manipulation, allowing him to strike with precision at the most vulnerable points of elven resistance, particularly Eregion, whose artisans had been central to the creation of the rings and whose proximity to Mordor made it strategically exposed. And the assault on Eregion was not merely a military objective, but a symbolic one, because the realm represented the highest achievement of cooperative craft and free creation, and its destruction served as a declaration that such independence would not be tolerated. And when Sauron's armies overwhelmed Eregion, the brutality of the conquest revealed the violence that had always been latent within his system, as artisans were slaughtered, knowledge seized, and the realm reduced to ruin, not out of mindless cruelty but calculated erasure, because Sauron understood that memory itself could be a form of resistance, and by annihilating a region he sought to erase the possibility that others might replicate its achievements without his oversight. And yet, even in victory, Sauron encountered resistance that challenged his assumptions, for the elves did not break as he expected, nor did they submit when faced with overwhelming force, instead retreating, regrouping, and preserving what they could beyond his reach, demonstrating that domination through destruction was less effective against beings whose identity was not tied solely to territory or material power. And this resilience forced Sauron to expand the scope of the war, drawing in additional realms and provoking a broader coalition of elves that stretched from Lindon to the hidden valleys of Middle-earth. And as the conflict intensified, it became clear that while Sauron excelled at planning and coordination, he struggled to adapt to opponents who refused to engage on his terms, because his worldview assumed that all actors sought stability through control, whereas the elves were willing to endure loss, displacement, and suffering rather than accept subjugation, and this willingness undermined the predictive models upon which Sauron relied, introducing uncertainty into a system designed to eliminate it. And the arrival of Númenorian aid further complicated the war, because it introduced a force that Sauron had not yet fully assessed, men whose power, discipline, and technological superiority altered the balance of the conflict and demonstrated that Middle-earth was not as isolated or malleable as he had believed. And faced with this new reality, Sauron was forced to retreat, temporarily preserving his strength rather than risk total defeat, a decision that once again highlights his prioritization of survival over pride. Yet this retreat did not signify failure, but recalibration, as Sauron learned from the war the limits of coercion and the dangers of provoking unified resistance too early, lessons that would inform his later dealings with Númenor and the Free Peoples. And in the aftermath of the war, the elves had succeeded in preventing immediate domination, but at tremendous cost, because a region was lost, its people scattered, and much of the knowledge that might have countered Sauron's designs was either destroyed or captured, leaving Middle-earth permanently altered, and this outcome reveals the tragic ambiguity of the conflict. For while Sauron did not achieve total victory, neither were the elves able to restore the world to its former state, and the rings remained. The One Ring endured, and the system Sauron had created, though damaged, was not dismantled, and in this sense the war can be understood not as a decisive clash between good and evil, but as the violent exposure of an ideological divide, the incompatibility between a vision of order imposed from above and a vision of freedom sustained through resilience and sacrifice. And although the elves emerged with their independence intact, they did so with the knowledge that the age of open creativity had ended, replaced by an era defined by vigilance, concealment, and withdrawal, a shift that represented a partial victory for Sauron, because even in defeat he had succeeded in narrowing the space in which freedom could operate. And as the Second Age continued, the memory of the war would shape the behavior of all peoples, instilling caution, fear, and a recognition that Sauron's threat was neither temporary nor easily confronted, and it is this enduring impact, rather than the immediate outcome of battles, that defines the war with the elves as one of the most consequential episodes in Middle-earth's history, because it demonstrated that domination, once attempted, cannot be fully undone, and that the cost of resisting a system built on control is not only measured in lives and lands, but in the permanent alteration of how societies imagine their future, setting the stage for Sauron's next and most devastating strategy, one that would target not elven resilience but human ambition, and would unfold not through open war, but through seduction, reverence, and the slow corruption of power itself. Chapter 7. If the elves represented endurance and memory, men represented possibility, and it was precisely this openness to change that made them both the greatest hope of Middle-earth and the most fertile ground for Sauron's corruption, because unlike the elves, whose long lives encouraged patience and reflection, men were defined by urgency, by the pressure of limited time, and by a profound awareness of mortality that shaped every ambition. And Sauron understood this difference with exceptional clarity, recognizing that where the elves feared fading, men feared ending, and that fear could be redirected into a hunger for power, longevity, and certainty. And so, after his wars with the elves exposed the limits of coercion, Sauron turned his attention toward men not as adversaries to be crushed, but as partners to be elevated, offering them gifts that promised to overcome the boundaries imposed by nature itself. And this approach marked a subtle yet decisive shift in his strategy, because rather than seeking to dominate existing hierarchies, he aimed to create new ones, rooted in loyalty to him rather than tradition or kinship. And central to this effort were the Nine Rings, artifacts crafted to resonate with human desire for authority and permanence. And when these rings were given to kings, sorcerers, and warriors among men, they were received not as instruments of enslavement, but as symbols of favor, proof that Sauron recognized their worth and potential, and this recognition was itself a powerful tool, because it transformed obedience into gratitude and submission into aspiration. And as the bearers of the Nine grew in power, extending their influence over realms and peoples, they came to associate their success with the rings and, by extension, with Sauron's guidance, a psychological bond that deepened over time as reliance replaced independence. And unlike the elves, who sensed intrusion and resisted, men experienced the rings as an extension of their own will, amplifying qualities they already valued such as command, decisiveness, and the ability to impose order, and this amplification masked the gradual erosion of autonomy that followed, because as their natural lifespans were unnaturally prolonged, their identities became increasingly bound to the power that sustained them, creating a dependence that Sauron exploited with ruthless patience, allowing the bearers to believe themselves sovereign even as they became shadows of his will. And this process reveals the distinctive cruelty of Sauron's corruption of men, for he did not strip them of agency immediately, but allowed them to exercise it within narrowing confines, rewarding obedience with continued power while punishing deviation with withdrawal, fear, and disorientation. And over time, this conditional empowerment hollowed them out, replacing moral judgment with reflexive loyalty, until the distinction between their desires and Sauron's commands dissolved entirely, and The transformation of the Nine into the Nazgul was not a sudden curse, but the culmination of a long degradation, a slow surrender of self in exchange for immortality without freedom, and through them Sauron achieved something he had never fully accomplished with the elves, the creation of servants who did not merely obey, but embodied his authority, extending his presence into the world even when he himself was absent or diminished. And this extension of presence was critical, because it allowed Sauron to rule indirectly, shaping events through intermediaries whose fear and devotion ensured absolute compliance. And yet the Nazgul were not the only means by which Sauron influenced men, because beyond the rings he cultivated systems of worship, law, and tradition that normalized obedience and framed domination as protection, particularly in regions far from elven influence, where memory of Morgoth's defeat had faded, and the promise of strong leadership held greater appeal than abstract ideals of freedom. And in these lands, Sauron presented himself not as a Dark Lord, but as a source of order in a chaotic world, encouraging the development of states and armies aligned with his interests, rewarding loyalty with stability, and punishing resistance with destruction, creating a political landscape in which submission appeared rational, even virtuous. And this rationalization of domination represents one of the most insidious aspects of Sauron's legacy, because it demonstrates how easily moral compromise can be institutionalized when fear and ambition converge. And as generations passed, men born into these systems accepted them as natural, inheriting loyalties shaped long before their time. And this intergenerational influence allowed Sauron's power to persist, even during periods of weakness, ensuring that his shadow remained present not only through force but through culture, memory, and expectation. And it is important to note that Sauron's relationship with men was not uniformly antagonistic, because he genuinely valued their adaptability, resilience, and capacity for growth, seeing in them the raw material for a world reshaped according to his design. And this valuation made his betrayal all the more tragic, because by offering men a path to greatness that required submission, he transformed their greatest strength into a source of enslavement, redirecting their drive toward mastery into a tool of his own supremacy. And yet, even as many men fell under his influence, others resisted, forming alliances with the elves and preserving traditions of independence that would later prove decisive. And this resistance underscores the inherent flaw in Sauron's approach, because while he understood the mechanism of power, he consistently underestimated the capacity of individuals and communities to act against self-interest for the sake of principle, a blind spot that allowed hope to survive even in the darkest circumstances. And as the Second Age progressed, the tension between these two trajectories among men, submission and resistance, would shape the fate of entire civilizations, culminating in the rise of Númenor as both Sauron's greatest threat and his most devastating opportunity, because Númenor embodied the potential of men uncorrupted, a society that combined strength, wisdom, and longevity without direct reliance on his gifts. And it was precisely this independence that made it intolerable to Sauron, setting the stage for a confrontation that would test the limits of his cunning and expose the ultimate cost of his philosophy, as he prepared to turn not merely individual leaders, but an entire empire, toward ruin through manipulation rather than war, demonstrating once again that his most effective victories were those achieved without the clash of armies, but through the slow redirection of desire, belief, and identity, a method perfected through his long engagement with men and refined into a strategy that would soon reshape the world itself. Chapter 8. Númenor was unlike any realm Sauron had encountered before, not merely in strength or splendor, but in the balance it represented between divine favor and mortal ambition, for it was a kingdom born from gratitude rather than conquest, gifted to men who had aided the Valar in the overthrow of Morgoth, and for generations it stood as proof that men could achieve greatness without surrendering their freedom. a proof that directly contradicted Sauron's belief that order required domination, and it was this contradiction that made Númenor intolerable to him, because as long as such a civilization existed, it exposed the falseness of his philosophy, and yet Númenor could not be destroyed through force alone, for its fleets ruled the seas, its armies rivaled those of the Eldar, and its knowledge surpassed that of any other human realm. And Sauron, ever adaptive, recognized that to defeat Númenor he would need to invert his usual method, allowing himself to be defeated in appearance in order to achieve victory in substance. And so, when the might of Númenor finally turned against him and its king came to Middle-earth with an overwhelming display of power, Sauron did not resist, but submitted, laying aside his weapons and presenting himself as a humble captive. And this calculated surrender was one of the most audacious acts of deception in his long history, because it required absolute confidence in his ability to manipulate not only individuals, but institutions, beliefs, and the psychology of an entire empire. And once brought to Númenor as a prisoner, Sauron began the most devastating phase of his career, one that demonstrated the full maturity of his craft as a corrupter, for stripped of armies and visible authority, he relied entirely on persuasion, patience, and insight into human fear. And at the heart of Númenorian society lay a tension that Sauron was uniquely equipped to exploit, the tension between gratitude for the gift of long life and resentment toward the limits that still remained, because although the Númenorians lived far longer than other men, they were not immortal, and as centuries passed, this distinction became a source of bitterness, especially as they watched the elves depart westward to lands from which they themselves were barred, and Sauron understood that this resentment, once nurtured, could eclipse even the memory of divine favor, and so he positioned himself not as an enemy of Númenor, but as a revealer of uncomfortable truths, subtly reframing the Valar not as benefactors, but as jealous guardians of immortality, withholding from men what they claimed for themselves. And this reframing was devastatingly effective because it transformed gratitude into grievance and obedience into humiliation, emotions that could be mobilized toward rebellion, and through careful counsel offered to the king and his court, Sauron encouraged policies that distanced Númenor from its ancient alliances, promoting isolation, militarization, and the pursuit of dominion over Middle-earth, not as acts of aggression but as assertions of rightful supremacy. And as these policies took hold, the cultural fabric of Númenor began to shift, with reverence for the Valar giving way to reverence for power itself. And it was within this ideological vacuum that Sauron introduced a new object of devotion, one that promised what the Valar denied, presenting Morgoth not as a defeated tyrant but as the true source of freedom and immortality, unjustly cast down by lesser powers, fearful of his generosity. And this inversion of moral reality represents the apex of Sauron's manipulation, because it required the systematic dismantling of Númenor's spiritual foundations, replacing them with a theology that sanctified domination and sacrifice in the name of transcendence. And under this influence, practices once considered abhorrent became normalized, as the pursuit of immortality justified cruelty, and dissent was reframed as treason against the future of the realm. And Sauron's role in this transformation was not overt, for he rarely commanded directly, instead allowing Númenorian leaders to believe they were acting independently, shaping a narrative in which their descent into darkness appeared as progress rather than corruption. And this illusion of autonomy was essential, because it prevented resistance from coalescing, fragmenting opposition, and isolating those who clung to the old ways. And as Númenor's society grew increasingly divided, Sauron's influence deepened, culminating in the construction of temples and rituals that institutionalized his worldview, binding the identity of the realm to a path that could only end in catastrophe. And yet, even as Númenor embraced this new doctrine, Sauron remained fundamentally cynical about its promise, because he did not truly believe immortality could be granted through worship or sacrifice, understanding instead that the value of such beliefs lay in their capacity to mobilize obedience and justify conquest. And this cynicism underscores the hollowness at the core of his philosophy, for he was willing to destroy an entire civilization, not to fulfill its aspirations, but to eliminate a contradiction to his own authority. And as Númenor's power expanded outward, its fleets and armies brought devastation to the coast of Middle-earth, spreading fear and resentment. Yet this expansion did not satisfy the deeper longing that Sauron had cultivated, the desire to escape death entirely. And when this desire finally reached its breaking point, it would drive Númenor to challenge the very order of the world, an act that Sauron both anticipated and encouraged, because he knew that such defiance would provoke a response beyond his own capacity to control. And in this knowledge lay his ultimate gamble, for by pushing Númenor toward open rebellion against the Valar, he sought to achieve in a single stroke what centuries of war had failed to accomplish, the destruction of the greatest human power in existence and the removal of divine influence from Middle-earth. And although he could not foresee the precise form this catastrophe would take, he was willing to risk everything, including his own physical form, because the annihilation of Númenor would leave a vacuum he believed only he could fill. And thus, as the island empire moved inexorably toward its doom, guided by pride, fear, and the promise of forbidden power, Sauron stood at the center of its transformation, not as a conqueror, but as a mirror reflecting its darkest impulses back to itself, proving that the most devastating form of evil is not imposed from without, but cultivated from within, and setting the stage for a downfall so complete that it would reshape the world and mark the definitive end of the Second Age, leaving behind not victory, but ruin, memory, and a legacy of warning that would echo through all ages to come. Chapter 9. The downfall of Númenor was not a sudden catastrophe imposed from beyond the world, but the final consequence of a long internal unraveling, a collapse prepared over generations through pride, fear, and the gradual abandonment of humility. And although the destruction itself would come through divine intervention, the path towards it was paved entirely by mortal choices, choices that Sauron had carefully nurtured without ever needing to command them directly, because by the time Númenor set its course toward ruin, the kingdom no longer required external manipulation to pursue destruction. Having internalized the logic that Sauron had introduced, namely that power was a right rather than a trust, that limits were insults rather than protections, and that mortality itself was an injustice to be corrected through force. And this internalization marks the true depth of Númenor's fall, for it demonstrates how thoroughly Sauron's worldview had replaced the values upon which the realm was founded, transforming a civilization blessed for its loyalty into one driven by resentment against the very order that had sustained it. And as Númenorian society grew increasingly obsessed with death and its avoidance, the reverence once directed toward the Valar and Eru Ilúvatar eroded, replaced by rituals, monuments, and policies that celebrated conquest, dominance, and defiance. And this shift was not merely religious, but existential, because it reframed the meaning of life itself, presenting death not as a natural conclusion, but as an enemy to be defeated, and in doing so it stripped life of its moral grounding, making any act permissible if it promised escape from mortality. And Sauron's role in this transformation was both central and paradoxical, because while he encouraged Númenor's rebellion, he did so with full awareness that the promised reward, immortality, could not be achieved through violence or worship, revealing the ultimate emptiness of his philosophy, which offered power without fulfillment and ambition without purpose. And yet this emptiness did not weaken his influence, but strengthened it, because it ensured that Númenor's desire would never be satisfied, driving it toward ever more extreme actions in pursuit of an impossible goal. And when the king of Númenor finally resolved to challenge the Ban of the Valar, directly by sailing west to claim immortality by force. This decision represented the culmination of all the tensions Sauron had cultivated, uniting fear of death, resentment of authority, and confidence in military power into a single, catastrophic act. And it is crucial to understand that Sauron did not merely anticipate this decision, but depended upon it, because it allowed him to destroy Númenor without wielding a weapon, shifting responsibility entirely onto its leaders, while positioning himself as a victim of the same divine judgment. And when the great armament set sail, leaving behind a divided people and a land already spiritually hollowed out, the act itself signaled the end of Númenor as it had ever been, for even before the seas were broken and the islands submerged, the realm had already severed its connection to grace, choosing domination over gratitude and defiance over wisdom. And the response from beyond the world was absolute, because the challenge posed by Númenor was not merely political or military, but metaphysical, an attempt by mortals to seize what had been explicitly denied to them, not out of malice, but out of mercy. And when the world was changed and Númenor was destroyed, the catastrophe served as both punishment and revelation, exposing the futility of seeking immortality through power and the danger of mistaking strength for legitimacy. And Sauron himself did not escape unscathed, for although his spirit endured, his physical form was annihilated, stripping him forever of the ability to assume a fair appearance, a loss that symbolized the final severing of his capacity to deceive through beauty and benevolence. And this transformation marked a profound shift in his relationship with the world, because while he survived, he emerged diminished, bound more tightly than ever to fear, coercion, and the mechanisms of domination he had constructed. And yet, even in this apparent defeat, Sauron's resilience is evident, because the destruction of Númenor removed the greatest obstacle to his supremacy in Middle-earth, eliminating a power that could have opposed him militarily and ideologically, and leaving behind only scattered survivors whose memory of Númenor's greatness was tempered by guilt, loss, and fragmentation. And this outcome reveals the bitter irony of the downfall, because in destroying itself to escape mortality, Númenor ensured that death would define its legacy, while Sauron, who had orchestrated its rebellion without believing in its promise, emerged positioned to reclaim influence over the world it left behind. And the reshaping of the world itself, the bending of the seas and the removal of the undying lands from mortal reach, further isolated Middle-earth, reinforcing Sauron's long-standing objective of eliminating divine oversight and concentrating power within the world alone. And although the Valar remained present in a diminished capacity, their withdrawal from direct intervention created a space in which Sauron could operate with greater freedom, relying on fear, memory, and the remnants of his systems to rebuild his dominion. And this rebuilding would not be immediate, for the loss of his body and the destruction of Númenor marked a period of weakness and recovery. Yet it also hardened his resolve, stripping away any lingering inclination toward persuasion, and replacing it with an uncompromising reliance on force and intimidation. And in this sense, the downfall of Númenor represents not only the end of a great human civilization, but the final clarification of Sauron's identity, transforming him irrevocably from a deceiver who wielded charm and counsel into a dark lord whose authority would rest openly upon terror. And as the Second Age drew toward its conclusion, the echoes of Númenor's destruction would shape the behavior of all peoples, instilling caution among the wise and fear among the ambitious, while Sauron, patient and unrepentant, prepared to rise once more, convinced that the removal of divine restraint had brought the world closer to the order he desired, and setting the stage for the final great confrontation of the age, in which the remnants of Númenor's legacy would confront the power that had helped destroy it, not to reclaim immortality, but to preserve the fragile freedom that still endured in Middle-earth. Chapter 10. The formation of the last alliance of elves and men was not an impulsive reaction to Sauron's resurgence, but the culmination of a long process of reckoning that followed the destruction of Númenor, as the survivors of that fallen realm, led by those who had remained faithful to the old ways, sought to preserve what little order and freedom still endured in Middle-earth. And it was within this context of loss, guilt, and determination that Sauron once again revealed both the strength and the fragility of his power. For although he returned to Middle-earth with his spirit intact and his will undiminished, the loss of his fair form marked a decisive shift in how he could interact with the world, forcing him to rely more heavily than ever on fear, intimidation, and open displays of dominance, and this reliance reshaped the nature of his rule, making it more overt and less adaptable. And yet, in the aftermath of Númenor's fall, Sauron initially appeared unassailable, because the greatest human power that might have opposed him had been erased, and many of the lesser realms of men, already accustomed to his influence, fell quickly into obedience, leaving only the elves and the Númenorian exiles as meaningful sources of resistance. And it was these exiles, carrying both the memory of Númenor's greatness and the shame of its corruption, who played a central role in organizing opposition, understanding that Sauron's rise was not merely a political threat but an existential one, capable of reshaping the world in his image if left unchecked. And as Sauron consolidated his power in Mordor, fortifying his strongholds and reasserting control over territories long influenced by his shadow, the leaders of the free peoples recognized that delay would only strengthen him, because unlike other enemies, Sauron did not exhaust himself through excess, but grew more dangerous the longer he was allowed to entrench, and thus the decision to confront him directly was born not of confidence, but of necessity, and the alliance that followed represented an extraordinary convergence of peoples who had often mistrusted one another, united by the shared understanding that survival required cooperation across cultural and historical divides. And this unity itself posed a challenge to Sauron's worldview, because it contradicted his belief that order could only be achieved through centralized authority, demonstrating instead that voluntary collaboration could produce strength without domination. And as armies gathered and plans were made, Sauron responded not with negotiation, but with the mobilization of overwhelming force, confident that his centralized command and the terror inspired by his reputation would fracture resistance before it reached his gates. And the early stages of the war reflected this confidence, as his forces pressed outward, seeking to disrupt coordination and isolate allies before they could fully combine their strength. Yet this strategy underestimated the resolve of those who had already lost everything, for the leaders of the alliance were driven not by ambition, but by a determination to prevent the repetition of Númenor's tragedy, a determination that made them willing to endure losses that Sauron's calculations had not fully accounted for. And as the war progressed, the limitations of Sauron's reliance on fear became increasingly apparent, because while fear can compel obedience, it cannot inspire sacrifice, and the alliance drew strength from a shared purpose that transcended individual survival, allowing them to persist through hardship in ways Sauron could not easily disrupt. And this asymmetry culminated in the long siege of Barad-dûr, a confrontation that tested the endurance of both sides and revealed the contrasting foundations of their power. For while Sauron's strength lay in fortifications, coordination, and the terror of his presence, the alliance's strength lay in persistence, mutual trust, and the willingness to accept uncertainty rather than submit to imposed order. And as the siege dragged on, Sauron's options narrowed because his centralized system left little room for improvisation once its primary mechanisms were engaged. And when he finally emerged to confront the leaders of the alliance directly, this act was both a display of confidence and a sign of constraint, because it revealed that even his vast power could not indefinitely substitute for decisive action. And the battle that followed, resulting in his defeat and the loss of the One Ring, is often remembered as a moment of triumph, yet its deeper significance lies in the way it exposed the fundamental flaw in Sauron's design, namely that by binding his power so completely to a single artifact and a single vision of control, he had made himself vulnerable to disruption, and the removal of the ring did not destroy Sauron outright, but it shattered the coherence of his system, severing the central node through which his authority flowed, and forcing his influence into a prolonged state of fragmentation. And this fragmentation marked the end of the Second Age not as a clear victory of good over evil, but as an unresolved interruption, because while Sauron was defeated, he was not destroyed, and the world that emerged from the war was not restored to harmony, but left scarred, diminished, and burdened by the knowledge that the threat of domination had not been eliminated, only delayed, and the leaders of the Alliance, in choosing not to destroy the ring when the opportunity arose, demonstrated the enduring power of temptation and the difficulty of rejecting control even in the name of freedom, a difficulty that Sauron had always relied upon. And in this failure lies the tragic continuity of his influence, because although he was cast down, the principles he embodied remained present, embedded in artifacts, institutions, and memories that would shape the course of the Third Age, and thus the Last Alliance stands as both a testament to the potential of unity and a warning of its fragility, illustrating that even the greatest cooperation cannot fully eradicate a philosophy that offers certainty in exchange for submission. And as the armies dispersed and the world entered a new age defined by vigilance rather than hope, Sauron endured as a shadow rather than a sovereign, waiting for the conditions under which his system might once again take root, confident that as long as fear, ambition, and the desire for order persisted among the peoples of Middle-earth, the foundations of his power would never truly disappear. Chapter 11. After his defeat at the hands of the Last Alliance and the loss of the One Ring, Sauron entered the most vulnerable yet revealing phase of his existence, a period defined not by visible dominion or open warfare, but by disembodiment, endurance, and the slow reconstitution of will in the absence of form, for stripped of his physical shape and severed from the central instrument of his power, he was reduced to a state that tested the very foundations of his identity, and it is precisely in this state of diminution that the true nature of Sauron's resilience becomes most apparent, because while lesser beings would have faded into irrelevance or dissolution, he persisted as a conscious intelligence, sustained not by hope or redemption, but by the same unyielding refusal to submit that had defined his choices since the end of the First Age, and this refusal manifested as patience rather than despair, as calculation rather than rage, for Sauron understood that power need not be immediate to be effective, and that survival itself constituted a strategic advantage in a world where memory fades and vigilance weakens over time. And thus the early centuries of the Third Age were marked by his deliberate withdrawal from overt action, allowing Middle-earth to believe that the threat had passed, even as he remained present in subtle ways, influencing events through fear, rumor, and the lingering effects of his former systems, and during this long interval he existed as a shadow without shape, unable to assume a fair form and limited in his capacity to act directly, yet far from powerless, because his will, though constrained, retained coherence and purpose, enabling him to observe, to learn, and to adapt his strategy to a world that had changed in response to his apparent defeat. And this adaptation was essential because the political and cultural landscape of Middle-earth no longer resembled that of the Second Age, with Númenor gone, the elves diminished, and the realms of men fragmented and uncertain, creating both obstacles and opportunities that Sauron would need to navigate carefully. And it is during this period that his reliance on intermediaries became absolute, as he could no longer command through presence or spectacle, but only through influence exerted upon those already predisposed to fear or ambition, and this reliance reshaped his approach to domination, emphasizing infiltration over conquest and endurance over expansion. And while the Nazgûl remained bound to his will, Their utility was limited by his own weakness, forcing him to conserve their deployment and focus instead on cultivating conditions favorable to his return, such as instability among men, distrust between allies, and the gradual erosion of ancient safeguards. And this focus on conditions rather than outcomes reveals a level of strategic maturity that distinguishes Sauron from more impulsive antagonists, because he recognized that domination is not achieved solely through strength but through timing, and that the right moment, once lost, can rarely be recovered through force alone. And so he waited, allowing the memory of his terror to fade into legend, trusting that as generations passed, the lessons of the last alliance would lose their immediacy and the vigilance of the free peoples would wane. And this trust was not misplaced, because as the Third Age progressed, the unity forged in war dissolved into regional concerns, and the great alliances of the past became stories rather than living commitments. And it was within this atmosphere of gradual forgetting that Sauron's shadow began to lengthen once more, not through grand declarations, but through the re-emergence of old patterns as men turned again toward power and security, and fear of the unknown resurfaced in lands once defended by stronger bonds, and even among the wise there arose a tendency to believe that the worst evils belonged irrevocably to the past, a belief that Sauron exploited by remaining silent, allowing others to underestimate him and attribute emerging darkness to lesser causes. And this strategic silence was itself a form of control, because it shaped perception by omission, guiding interpretation without revealing intent. And as centuries passed, Sauron's will slowly coalesced, regaining coherence and strength sufficient to anchor itself to specific locations and agents, culminating eventually in his presence in places of lingering darkness where fear and secrecy provided shelter. And this gradual re-anchoring did not signify a return to former glory, but a transition into a new mode of existence, one in which Sauron accepted limitation as a condition rather than a failure, understanding that even diminished power could be lethal if applied with precision. And this acceptance marks a significant evolution in his character, because it demonstrates his capacity to subordinate immediate ambition to long-term objectives, a trait that allowed him to survive defeats that would have annihilated a less disciplined will. And yet this discipline did not bring him closer to wisdom or restraint, but hardened his commitment to domination, as the loss of form intensified his reliance on fear and coercion, stripping away any remaining inclination toward persuasion or shared purpose. And in this sense, the Third Age Sauron was both weaker and more dangerous than before. Weaker in visible power and adaptability, yet more dangerous in intent, because his experiences had convinced him that mercy, collaboration, and compromise were illusions that only delayed the inevitable assertion of control. And this conviction shaped his every action as he prepared for a return that would not repeat the mistakes of the past, avoiding premature confrontation and focusing instead on consolidating influence through indirect means. And it is during this prolonged shadowed existence that the groundwork was laid for the events that would later define the War of the Ring, because the systems Sauron relied upon, fear among men, fragmentation of alliances, and the normalization of obedience, were not created suddenly, but cultivated patiently over centuries, allowing him to re-emerge not as a memory resurrected, but as a force that had never truly disappeared. And this continuity underscores the central tragedy of Middle-earth's history, that evil, once embedded within structures and habits, does not require constant reinforcement to persist, but can survive in silence, waiting for conditions favorable to its resurgence. And thus, Sauron's time as a shadow, without form, stands as one of the most instructive chapters of his story, revealing that his greatest strength was not his armies or artifacts, but his capacity to endure, to wait, and to believe with the unshakable certainty that the world, left to its own devices, would eventually seek the very order he alone claimed to provide, a belief that sustained him through centuries. of weakness and guided him inexorably toward his next incarnation, hidden, patient, and poised to strike when resistance had grown complacent. Chapter 12. Dol Guldur, the Hill of Sorcery, was not chosen by Sauron for its grandeur or strategic dominance alone, but for its suitability as a place of concealment, a locus where fear, secrecy, and lingering corruption could shelter a will still recovering from catastrophic loss. And it is in this choice that the continuity of Sauron's evolving strategy becomes most evident, because rather than seeking to reassert himself through dramatic conquest, he selected a shadowed stronghold that allowed him to observe, influence, and destabilize Middle-earth without drawing the full attention of its remaining guardians. And this subtlety was essential, for in the early Third Age, Sauron lacked both the strength and the unity of forces required for open war, and any premature display of power would have invited destruction before his systems were fully re-established. And thus, Dol Guldur functioned not as a capital of empire, but as a laboratory of domination, a place where influence could be tested, fear cultivated, and the long erosion of resistance quietly advanced. And from this hidden seat, Sauron began to exert pressure on the surrounding regions, particularly Greenwood the Great, whose transformation into Mirkwood stands as one of the most tangible consequences of his presence. For the forest did not fall to armies or fire, but to a creeping dread that distorted perception, fostered suspicion, and isolated its inhabitants, demonstrating once again Sauron's preference for psychological over physical conquest, because a land consumed by fear polices itself, requiring little direct intervention, and as darkness spread through the forest, it disrupted trade, travel, and communication, fragmenting alliances and weakening the connective tissue that bound the free peoples together. And this fragmentation was not incidental, but deliberate, because Sauron understood that isolation breeds vulnerability, and that communities cut off from one another are more likely to prioritize survival over solidarity. And beyond the forest, Dol Guldur's influence reached into the politics of men, particularly in regions already inclined toward instability, where rumors of a rising shadow encouraged militarization, suspicion, and authoritarian measures that aligned inadvertently with Sauron's worldview, and in this way his power grew not through overt allegiance, but through the normalization of fear-driven governance, as leaders justified harsh policies in response to perceived threats, thereby replicating the logic of domination without direct instruction. And this capacity to shape outcomes indirectly marks the maturity of Sauron's Third Age strategy, because it allowed him to conserve strength while others unknowingly enacted his principles. And during this period, Sauron deliberately avoided reclaiming the ring or revealing his true identity, operating instead under the guise of the Necromancer, a title that both concealed his significance and redirected attention toward more limited interpretations of his power, encouraging the wise to underestimate the scope of the threat and delay decisive action. And this delay proved invaluable, because it granted him centuries to rebuild networks of loyalty, corruption, and fear without provoking unified resistance. And even when suspicions arose and councils debated the nature of the shadow in the forest, the absence of clear evidence allowed doubt to prevail, reinforcing the tendency to defer confrontation. And this pattern of hesitation reveals one of Sauron's most enduring advantages, his ability to exploit uncertainty, because while open evil invites opposition, ambiguous danger invites debate, and debate consumes time, resources, and resolve, all of which Sauron could afford to lose less than his enemies. And as Dol Guldur became increasingly associated with terror, its very existence altered strategic calculations across Middle-earth, compelling leaders to divert attention and resources toward defense rather than cooperation, further weakening collective resistance. And within Dol Guldur itself, Sauron continued to refine his methods, experimenting with the use of fear as an organizing principle, shaping servants whose loyalty was maintained not through ideological alignment, but through dread and dependency, a model that would later be replicated on a much larger scale in Mordor. And this experimentation underscores the continuity between Dol Guldur and Sauron's later dominion, because the fortress served as a proving ground for techniques that would define the War of the Ring, including the use of terror to suppress dissent, the manipulation of information to control perception, and the strategic deployment of agents to extend influence beyond direct reach. And yet, Dol Guldur was also a place of limitation, for it reflected Sauron's constrained circumstances, forcing him to operate within a narrower scope than he desired. And this constraint fostered both caution and resentment, as he remained acutely aware that his true power lay elsewhere, bound to the ring and the lands of Mordor. And this awareness fueled a long-term objective to return openly and re-establish centralized authority once conditions permitted. And when pressure from the wise eventually compelled him to withdraw from Dol Guldur, this retreat was not a defeat but a transition, because by that time his objectives had largely been achieved, the forest was corrupted, fear had taken root across vast regions, and the free peoples had been conditioned to respond defensively rather than proactively, and thus Dol Guldur can be understood not as a failed stronghold, but as a successful phase in Sauron's long campaign, a phase that demonstrated the effectiveness of indirect domination and prepared the psychological and political landscape for his return to Mordor. And it is in this preparation that the significance of Dol Guldur truly lies, for it represents the moment when Sauron proved that even without the ring, without open sovereignty, and without visible power, he could still reshape the world through patience, manipulation, and fear, confirming his belief that domination does not require constant presence, only enduring influence, and setting the stage for the final escalation of his strategy in the late Third Age, when the shadows he had cultivated would converge into a single, unmistakable threat, forcing Middle-earth to confront once more the question it had long sought to avoid, whether security achieved through control was worth the cost of freedom, a question Sauron had been shaping for centuries, waiting for the moment when the world would be compelled to answer it. Chapter 13. By the late Third Age, Sauron's strategy had reached its most refined and paradoxical form, for he no longer sought rapid expansion or dramatic conquest, but the careful orchestration of inevitability, shaping a world in which resistance would appear futile long before it was physically crushed. And this approach was born directly from the lessons of his earlier failures, because open war had united his enemies, deception had limits once exposed, and reliance on a single artifact had introduced vulnerabilities he could not afford to repeat. And thus his renewed pursuit of domination was grounded in patience, redundancy, and psychological pressure, ensuring that even if one element failed, the broader system would endure. And at the core of this strategy lay the deliberate fragmentation of opposition, as Sauron understood that unity among the free peoples posed the greatest threat to his rule, not because it matched his power, but because it disrupted his ability to predict and control outcomes, and so he worked tirelessly to prevent alliances from forming, exploiting old grievances, cultural differences, and mutual suspicions, allowing ancient divisions between elves and men, between realms of men themselves, and between free peoples and their own leaders to fester and widen. And this manipulation of division did not require constant intervention, because it relied on amplifying tendencies already present, encouraging isolation and self-interest under the guise of prudence. And in this way, Sauron transformed caution into paralysis, convincing many that survival depended on retreat rather than cooperation. And alongside this fragmentation, he pursued the normalization of fear, cultivating an atmosphere in which dread became a constant background condition rather than a response to specific threats. because fear that is ever present ceases to provoke decisive action and instead reshapes behavior subtly, encouraging compliance, silence, and the acceptance of harsh measures as necessary evils, and Sauron's agents, whether Nazgûl or lesser servants, were deployed not merely to enforce obedience, but to serve as symbols of inevitability, reminders that resistance would be seen, remembered, and punished, even if not immediately. And this symbolic function was essential, because it allowed Sauron to extend his influence far beyond the reach of his armies, shaping choices in distant lands through reputation alone. And yet fear was only one pillar of his strategy, because fear without structure leads to chaos, and chaos undermines the order he sought to impose. And thus Sauron paired terror with organization, building systems of command, supply, and surveillance that mirrored his belief in centralized authority, ensuring that every act of obedience reinforced the system that demanded it. And this bureaucratic dimension of his power is often overlooked, yet it represents one of his greatest strengths because it transformed domination from a series of violent acts into a self-sustaining process, where individuals enforced rules not because Sauron watched them constantly, but because the system had conditioned them to do so. And in this sense, Sauron's empire functioned less like a horde and more like an apparatus, efficient, disciplined, and resilient, capable of functioning even in his absence. And this resilience was further enhanced by his use of proxies, leaders among men who governed in his name while believing themselves autonomous, reproducing his worldview through their own ambitions. And this delegation of authority allowed Sauron to conserve his strength while extending his reach, reducing the risk associated with centralized failure and ensuring that loyalty was embedded at multiple levels. And yet, despite this sophistication, Sauron's strategy retained a critical blind spot, one that had persisted since his earliest days, namely his inability to fully comprehend motivations not rooted in power, fear, or self-interest, and this blind spot shaped how he interpreted the actions of his enemies, leading him to underestimate the significance of compassion, sacrifice, and humility as sources of strength, because within his framework such qualities were irrational, inefficient, and ultimately self-defeating, and therefore he interpreted acts of mercy as weakness and acts of restraint as indecision, misjudgments that would later prove decisive, and this misinterpretation extended to his assessment of the ring's fate, because while he anticipated that others would seek to use it against him, he could not conceive that anyone would willingly seek its destruction, as this would require rejecting not only power, but the very logic that had governed his own existence. And this inability to imagine renunciation shaped his strategic calculations, leading him to focus on military confrontation and political domination rather than the protection of the ring itself from selfless intent. And even as he mobilized vast forces and prepared for open war, his confidence rested on the assumption that all meaningful actors would behave within predictable parameters, seeking advantage, security, or survival. And this assumption allowed him to manipulate events with extraordinary effectiveness for much of the Third Age, because in most cases it was correct, as fear and ambition did drive the decisions of many, and yet it also planted the seed of his downfall, because it blinded him to the possibility that the most consequential actions would be taken by those who sought neither power nor glory. And, as the War of the Ring approached, Sauron's strategy reached its apparent culmination, with alliances among his enemies weakened, fear pervasive across Middle-earth, and his own forces organized and prepared for decisive conflict. And from his perspective, the outcome appeared inevitable, because the world had been shaped to accept his rise as the natural resolution of disorder, and resistance appeared fragmented, hesitant, and outmatched. And yet, beneath this surface lay currents he had not fully accounted for, acts of quiet defiance, unexpected alliances, and moral choices that did not conform to his expectations. And these currents flowed precisely because his system, for all its efficiency, left no space for trust, generosity, or hope, values that could not be instrumentalized and therefore existed outside his control. And it is this exclusion that ultimately defines the limit of his Third Age strategy, because a system that denies the legitimacy of such values cannot anticipate their impact. And as events moved inexorably toward confrontation, Sauron remained convinced that history itself favored his design, unaware that the very patience and endurance that had sustained him for so long had also allowed his enemies the time to rediscover the power of unity and sacrifice, preparing not merely to oppose his armies, but to challenge the foundational assumptions upon which his dominion was built, setting the stage for a final conflict that would not be decided solely by strength or numbers, but by the rejection of the principles Sauron had spent ages imposing upon the world. Chapter 14. The War of the Ring was not, from Sauron's perspective, a desperate gamble or a final stand, but the logical culmination of centuries of preparation, a conflict he believed had already been decided long before the first armies marched or the first battles were fought, because by the time open war erupted, the conditions he valued most were firmly in place. Fear had permeated the political and cultural landscape of Middle-earth. Alliances among the free peoples were fragile and incomplete, and his own forces were organized according to a centralized logic that prioritized efficiency, obedience, and overwhelming pressure. And it is within this context that the true nature of Sauron's power during the war must be understood, for he did not fight as a general seeking glory on the battlefield, but as an administrator of domination, directing movements, resources, and terror from a distance, confident that the machinery he had constructed would function without his direct presence. And this confidence was not unfounded, because the early stages of the war demonstrated the effectiveness of his system. As regions long exposed to his influence fell quickly into compliance, resistance was isolated and suppressed, and fear compelled many to remain neutral or submit rather than risk annihilation. And yet, this same reliance on systemic control revealed a subtle vulnerability, because a system designed to eliminate unpredictability becomes increasingly brittle when confronted with actions that fall outside its assumptions. And throughout the War of the Ring, Sauron consistently interpreted events through the lens of power politics, assuming that his enemies would act as he would in their position, seeking to wield the ring against him, consolidate military strength, and preserve their own authority. And this assumption shaped his deployment of forces, leading him to focus overwhelming attention on centers of political and military significance, such as Gondor, because within his framework, victory was achieved by breaking visible resistance and seizing the symbols of sovereignty. And in this sense, the war unfolded largely on terms he had anticipated, with massive armies advancing, cities besieged, and the fate of entire regions hinging on the outcome of set-piece confrontations. And Sauron's capacity to coordinate these operations across vast distances without direct oversight stands as a testament to the effectiveness of his centralized command, because even without the ring, his will exerted sufficient coherence to maintain discipline and direction among forces driven as much by fear as by loyalty. And this coherence allowed him to sustain pressure relentlessly, forcing his enemies into defensive postures that limited their ability to respond creatively. And yet, while Sauron's military strategy was formidable, it was also constrained by his own conceptual limitations, because he could not imagine a victory that did not culminate in domination, and therefore he could not imagine a strategy that sought not to defeat him militarily, but to render his power irrelevant. And this failure of imagination is central to understanding how the War of the Ring unfolded, because while Sauron focused on crushing opposition through force, his enemies pursued a parallel course of action grounded in secrecy, sacrifice, and trust, values that lay entirely outside his calculations. And it is important to note that this divergence was not immediately apparent, because the visible war conformed closely enough to Sauron's expectations to reinforce his confidence, and each apparent success, each city overrun or army dispersed, confirmed his belief that resistance was collapsing as predicted, and this belief encouraged him to commit even more fully to the logic of overwhelming pressure, escalating attacks and accelerating timetables, convinced that final victory was imminent, and in doing so he revealed the rigidity of his approach, because acceleration reduced his margin for adaptation, locking him into a course of action that assumed control could only be achieved through domination, rather than denial, and this assumption blinded him to the significance of small-scale actions that did not seek power, because within his worldview such actions were strategically irrelevant. And yet it was precisely these actions that would determine the outcome of the war, because by entrusting the fate of the ring to those who sought neither command nor conquest, his enemies exploited the deepest flaw in his system, the belief that power is always desired and therefore always contested. And, as the war intensified, Sauron's attention remained fixed on the movements of armies and leaders, interpreting every decision as a maneuver within a familiar strategic game, and this focus allowed him to respond effectively to conventional threats, but it also narrowed his awareness, making him increasingly reactive rather than perceptive. And when uncertainty arose, he resolved it by applying more force, reinforcing the very dynamics that led him to misinterpret the true nature of the danger he faced, and this pattern reached its peak as the war approached its apparent climax, with Sauron convinced that a final confrontation would decide the fate of Middle-earth, unaware that the decisive act would occur not through conquest, but through renunciation, and this unawareness underscores the fundamental incompatibility between his philosophy and the moral reality of the world he sought to rule, because a system built on domination cannot recognize self-sacrifice as a form of agency, and therefore cannot defend against it. And when the ring was destroyed, the collapse of Sauron's power was immediate and total, not because his armies were defeated or his fortresses breached, but because the central principle upon which his authority depended ceased to exist, revealing that his dominion, for all its apparent strength, was ultimately contingent, dependent on an artifact and a worldview that could not survive the rejection of power itself. And this collapse demonstrates that the War of the Ring was decided not by superior force, but by the refusal to engage on Sauron's terms, a refusal that invalidated his assumptions and rendered his preparations obsolete. And yet, even in defeat, the war serves as a warning, because it illustrates how close Middle-earth came to accepting domination as the price of security, and how easily fear and fragmentation might have carried the day had events unfolded only slightly differently. And in this sense the War of the Ring stands not merely as the final military conflict of Sauron's career, but as the ultimate test of his philosophy, a test it failed because it could not accommodate the possibility that freedom, when chosen deliberately and defended through sacrifice, can outlast even the most carefully constructed system of control, bringing an end not only to a dark lord's reign, but to the idea that order imposed through domination can ever produce lasting peace. Chapter 15. Sauron fails not because he lacks power, intelligence, or endurance, but because his understanding of the world is ultimately incomplete, rooted in a vision of order so rigid that it cannot accommodate the full range of moral possibility inherent in free beings, and it is this philosophical limitation, rather than any single defeat or miscalculation, that defines the true end of his long struggle against Middle-earth, for throughout every age of his existence he remains consistent in one fundamental assumption, that stability is superior to freedom, that unity requires domination, and that the wills of others are obstacles to be managed rather than realities to be respected. And this assumption shapes every strategy he employs, from deception to terror, from collaboration to conquest, creating systems that are efficient, resilient, and terrifyingly effective, yet also inherently brittle. because they depend on the reduction of complexity, the elimination of unpredictability, and the denial of moral agency beyond obedience, and while such systems can dominate for a time, they cannot adapt to choices made outside their logic, particularly choices rooted in sacrifice, humility, and the deliberate rejection of power, concepts that Sauron never fully understands because they contradict the framework through which he interprets existence itself. And this misunderstanding is not accidental, but the result of a long internal trajectory that begins with his earliest identity as Mairon, a spirit who loved order more than harmony and precision, more than compassion. And while these qualities were not evil in themselves, they became so when elevated above all others, transforming a desire for structure into a refusal to accept plurality. And it is this refusal that prevents Sauron from learning from defeat, because while he adapts tactically, refining methods and correcting errors, he never questions the premise that domination is necessary, and thus, every loss is interpreted not as a warning, but as evidence that domination must be more complete, more centralized, and more absolute, a pattern that drives him to invest ever greater portions of himself into mechanisms of control, culminating in the One Ring, which embodies both the height of his power and the depth of his blindness. Because by binding his fate to an artifact designed to enforce obedience, he ensures that his survival depends on the very logic that cannot tolerate renunciation. And when that logic is finally rejected, his entire system collapses at once, revealing that it was never as inevitable as he believed. And this collapse exposes the central paradox of Sauron's failure, that in seeking to eliminate uncertainty, he makes himself vulnerable to it, because a system that assumes all actors desire power cannot anticipate those who do not. And throughout the history of Middle-earth, it is precisely such actors who disrupt his plans, individuals and communities, who choose solidarity over dominance, restraint over conquest, and trust over control. Choices that appear insignificant within Sauron's calculations yet accumulate into a force he cannot neutralize. And this accumulation is slow, fragile, and often costly, but it persists because it is not centralized, not dependent on a single leader or artifact, and therefore cannot be dismantled through the removal of one node. And in contrast, Sauron's dominion, for all its scale, remains concentrated, reliant on fear, hierarchy, and the continuous reinforcement of authority. And when that reinforcement is broken, even briefly, the system begins to unravel, as obedience sustained by terror cannot survive the sudden absence of the power that inspires it. And this unraveling reveals another dimension of his failure, the inability to inspire loyalty that is freely given, because while Sauron commands obedience, he never earns trust, and without trust, no system can endure beyond the presence of force, and this distinction becomes decisive at the end of the Third Age, when the free peoples, though divided and weakened, are still capable of cooperation because their alliances are voluntary rather than imposed, allowing them to adapt, recover, and persist even in defeat, whereas Sauron's forces, bound together by fear and compulsion, disintegrate the moment his will is removed, demonstrating that domination produces strength only so long as it is actively enforced. And this insight reframes the entire arc of Sauron's history, revealing that his apparent inevitability was always contingent, dependent on the continued acceptance of his premises by others, and when those premises are finally rejected, not through force but through moral choice, his power evaporates with startling speed, leaving behind not a transformed world but one still capable of healing. And in this sense, Sauron's failure is not merely personal, but instructional, serving as a demonstration of the limits of authoritarian order, because it shows that systems built on control can shape behavior, suppress dissent, and dominate landscapes, Yet they cannot extinguish the capacity for choice, and it is this capacity that ultimately defines Middle-earth's resilience, because while evil can endure through patience and fear, it cannot comprehend hope that does not seek reward, courage that does not seek recognition, or sacrifice that does not seek victory. And these incomprehensible acts form the foundation of Sauron's defeat, not as miracles, but as expressions of a moral reality he refused to acknowledge. And thus, the end of Sauron is not the destruction of a being, but the rejection of a world view, the affirmation that order without freedom is not peace, that unity without consent is not harmony, and that power divorced from humility cannot sustain itself indefinitely. And in this rejection lies the true resolution of his story, because while his shadow passes and his name becomes a warning rather than a threat, the questions he raised remain, challenging each age to decide whether security is worth submission, and whether control is preferable to uncertainty. Questions that Middle-earth answers not once, but continually, through the fragile, imperfect, and enduring choice to remain free.